Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of my dramatic reading of the Edge Chronicles Stormchaser. Chapter 3, Cries and Whispers, Part 1, In the Twilight Woods. It was twilight. It was always twilight in these woods, with the sun permanently setting. Or was it rising? It was difficult to tell. Certainly none who entered the Twilight Woods could ever be sure. Most, however, felt that the golden half-light between the trees whispered of endings, not beginnings. The trees, majestically tall and always in full leaf, swayed in a gentle breeze which endlessly circled the woods. They, like everything else, the grass, the ground, the flowers, were coated in a mantle of fine dust, which glittered and glistened like frost. Yet it was not cold. Far from it. The breeze was balmy, and the earth itself radiated a soothing warmth which rippled through the air above, so that everything swam slightly before the eyes. Nothing was quite in focus. Standing in the twilight woods was like standing underwater. There was no bird song, no insect rustle, no animal cry, for none of these creatures inhabited the woods. Yet, to those with ears to hear, there were voices, and not simply the whisperings of the trees. They were real voices, muttering, mumbling, occasionally crying out. One was close by. "Hold steady, Vinchix," it said wearily, though not without hope. "Nearly there. Hold steady now." The voice came from high up in the air, where a wrecked skyship was skewered on a jagged treetop, its broken mast pointing accusingly up at the sky out of which it had dropped. Dangling from a harness was a knight, seated upon his Pralgrin charger and silhouetted against the golden sky. Inside the rusted armor, their bodies were skeletal, yet both the knight and his mount were alive. Still alive. The visor creaked and the ghostly voice repeated its words of encouragement, words of command. "Nearly there, Vinchix. Hold steady." Part 2, In the Palace of the Most High Academe. The chamber, or inner sanctum as it was known, was truly sumptuous. The floors were carpeted with snow-white fur, the ceiling embossed with gold, while those areas of wall not lined with bookcases were paneled with black wood and silver, and encrusted with precious stones. Ornaments cluttered every surface, porcelain vases and ivory figurines, ornate carvings, and intricate timepieces. A crystal chandelier sparkled from the center of the room, unlit but glinting in the sunlight, shooting darts of brilliance all around the room. On the silver panels they flickered, on the polished tables, the cabinets, the grand piano, on the portraits and mirrors, and on the gleaming pates of the Most High Academe of Sanctifrax himself, who was stretched out on an ottoman next to the long arched window, fast asleep. He looked out of place in the opulent surroundings. The black gown he wore was faded, and there were sandals on his feet. Modest, scuffed. Likewise, his angular body and sunken cheeks spoke of a life in abstinence rather than indulgence. His shaven head, of humility and rigor, yet also a degree of vanity. After all, why else would a person have his personal monogram, VIP, stitched into the hem of his hair shirt? A high-pitched rasping vibrated throughout the chamber. The person stirred and rolled onto his side. His hooded eyes snapped open. The rasping sound came again, louder than before. He sat up and peered through the window. Situated at the top of the tallest and certainly most magnificent tower in Sanctifrax, the inner sanctum offered breathtaking views across Undertown and beyond. The Most High Academe looked down. Between the billowing clouds of smoke, he could just make out half a dozen or so Undertowners busily securing the latest chain to the side of the great floating rock. "Splendid," he yawned, and climbed stiffly to his feet. He stretched, scratched, and rubbed a hand absent-mindedly over his head, and yawned again. "Things to be done." He strode over towards a massive ironwood chest which stood in the corner of the room, pulled a heavy iron key from the folds of his robes, and crouched down. At sundown, he was to have a meeting with Simenon Zintax, the current League's master. Before then, he wanted to weigh the remaining frax dust and calculate just how long the precious specs would last. The lock released with a soft click, the lid creaked open, and the Most High Academe stared down into the gaping darkness within. He bent down, retrieved a glass vial, held it up to the window, and sighed. Even he could see that the liquid dust was all but gone. "A problem, certainly," he muttered, "but not yet an emergency. Better get it weighed, though. Work out just how many particles of frax dust remain. Bargaining with Zintax from a point of ignorance would be fatal." He wiggled round irritably. "But first I've got to do something about this intolerable itching." Thankfully, thoughtful to the last, Manulus, his manservant, had remembered the back-scratcher. A pretty thing it was, with a solid gold handle and claws of dragon ivory. The Most High Academe squirmed with pleasure as he scraped it up and down his back, reminded, as he always was, that the greatest pleasures in life are often the simplest. He lay the scratcher down and, deciding to postpone his calculations a while longer, poured himself a glass of wine from the decanter which Manulus had also thought to bring. He walked across the room and stopped in front of a full-length mirror, smiled, straightened up, and lifted his head. "To you, Vilnix Pomponius," he said, raising his glass, "the Most High Academe of Sanctifrax." At that moment the drilling began again, louder than ever. The floating rock trembled, the inner sanctum rocked, and the mirror shook. The Most High Academe was so startled that he let the glass slip from between his fingers. It broke with a muffled clink, and the spilt wine spread out over the white fur like blood. The Most High Academe turned and stepped away in disgust. As he did, he heard a breathy whooshing sound behind him, followed by an almighty crash. He froze, turned back, and there, lying on the floor in 1,000 pieces, was the mirror. Crouching, he picked up a piece of glass and turned it over in his hand. What was it his grandmother used to say? "A broken looking-glass, a sorrow come to pass." He stared at the dark eye staring back at him from the jagged fragment and winked. "It's a good job you're not superstitious," he said, and cackled with laughter. Part 3. In the Mire. The leader of the Knock Goblins, a short, stocky female by the name of Mim, sniffed the air, fingered the collections of talismans and amulets around her neck, and stepped forwards. She winced as the soft mud oozed between her stubby toes. Screed Toe-Taker watched her scornfully. "Still think you can make it across the mire on your own?" he said. Mim ignored him and waded on. Squat, 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 went the pale, sticky mud as it covered first her ankles, then her calves, then her knees. She stopped and looked up. The mire seemed to stretch out forever in front of her. Even if she, by some miracle, could make it across to the other side, she knew that neither old Torp nor the young'uns would stand a chance. "All right," she said, and turned angrily, sinking down further still in the process. "Perhaps we could be doing with a guide after all." She hitched her skirt up. The mud crept higher. "Help us out of here," she said. Screed stepped forwards and held out a bony white hand. Like the mire which was his home, every inch of his body had been bleached the color of dirty sheets. He pulled the goblin back to safety and stared down at her, hands on hips. The goblin rummaged inside her bag. 50 per person, she said. "That's what you said, which makes..." She counted out the coins. 500 in all. Screed shook his head. "The price has gone up," he said, his voice nasal, mocking. 100 each. That's what it's gonna cost you now." "But that's all of our savings," she gasped. "What are we ever supposed to live on when we do make it to Undertown?" Screed shrugged. "That's your problem," he said. "I'm not forcing you to come with me. If you can cross the mire with its sinking mud and poisonous blowholes, not to mention the mug lumps, ooze fish, and white ravens that would rip you apart as soon as look at you, well, it's your choice. Mim stared glumly at the rest of her family group huddled together on the bank. The choice was simple, she realized. Either they arrived in Undertown with nothing, or they didn't arrive at all.
1,000 it is,
she sighed, handing over the money.
But your price is very high, so it is.
Screed Toe-Taker snatched the money and dropped it into his pocket. He turned away, muttering under his breath. My price is higher than you could ever imagine, dear lady. And he set off into the bleached and sticky landscape. The family of goblins collected up their sacks of belongings. Come on, then, Screed called back impatiently. Look lively, keep together, walk where I walk, and don't look back. Part 4. In the Tower of Light and Darkness. The Professor of Light was angry. Accursed chains, accursed drilling, accursed Vilnix Pomponius, he growled between clenched teeth. Must we now destroy Sanctifrax in order to save it? He heaved himself up with an armful of books and began returning them to the shelves. It was always the same. Every time a new chain was attached to the floating rock, the vibrations wreaked havoc in his humble study. Priceless apparatus was damaged, invaluable experiments ruined, and his entire library of books ended up on the floor. With the last book back in place, the professor returned to his desk. He was just about to sit down when he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. Something most unwelcome. At that moment, however, there was a knock on the door, and the Professor of Darkness burst in. We must talk, he said. The Professor of Light didn't move. Look, he said. What? There, he said, pointing. Light! The Professor of Darkness laughed. You should be pleased, he said. Light is, after all, your field of study and expertise. As yours is darkness, the Professor of Light snapped. Or rather, the absence of light. But there is a place for everything, and just as the darkness in the heart of your erstwhile protege Vilnix Pomponius is misplaced, so too is the light appearing in the cracks in my wall. He turned back and pointed at the mortar. See that, he said. It's all crumbling away. The Professor of Darkness sighed miserably. My study is just as bad, he said. The first thing Vilnix had done when he became Most High Academe was to take the palatial School of Light and Darkness for himself, while relegating the two professors and their departments to the dilapidated Rain Taster's Tower. The explosion had caused bad structural damage. Each time a chain was attached to the rock, that damage increased. It was merely a matter of time before the tower collapsed completely. Well, it can't go on like this, said the Professor of Light. Which is why we need to talk, the Professor of Darkness butted in. Which is why, the Professor of Light continued, I have already spoken to someone about how one might change the situation. The Professor of Darkness stared at his colleague with a mixture of admiration and resentment. Despite their reduced circumstances, the old rivalry between the two academics remained. You've already spoken to whom? He demanded. Mother Horsefeather, came the reply. Mother Horsefeather! The Professor of Darkness was astounded. That greedy old bird woman! She'd sell her own eggs if the price was right. Do you seriously think we can trust her? Oh, yes, said the Professor of Light. We can trust her to do everything in her power to deceive us. That knowledge will be our strength. Part 5. In the Back Streets of Undertown. In here, said Slitch, stopping abruptly next to a ramshackle hut on his left. He unlocked the door and disappeared inside. His companion followed him. He pushed the door to and waited while the knock goblin located the lamp and lit it. My word, Slitch shuddered as he turned around and the pale light filled the room. You slaughterers are red. Tendon shuffled about awkwardly. Have you got any frax dust or what? He said. If you haven't... The best frax dust in Undertown, Slitch assured him. Potentially. I've acquired some black market storm frax, he explained. All you have to do is grind it down and hob's your goblin. Tendon stared at him impassively. You must think I'm daft, he said at length. Stormfrax explodes when you try and grind it. Everyone knows that. His high and mighty Acker Dimwit's the only one with the secret. I do now have that secret, said Slitch. He took a bowl down from the shelf and placed it on a small table. Then he pulled a wad of velvet from his inside pocket, carefully unfolded it and removed a glistening, sparkling shard of Stormfrax, which he held up between his middle finger and thumb, the others all being missing, and placed it down gently in the bowl. Tendon remained dubious. What's the secret, then? This, said Slitch, removing a leather pouch from his belt. He loosened the drawstring for Tendon to see inside. But what is it? He said. Powdered deadwood bark, said Slitch conspiratorially. The finest money could buy. Tendon pulled back nervously. It was the stuff Undertown doctors used to anesthetize their patients for an operation. The numbing qualities of the deadwood counteract the volatility of the stormfrax, Slitch explained. The explosion is paralyzed, so to speak. You sure about that? Said Tendon. Oh, for sky's sake, said Slitch impatiently. Didn't you tell me you were sick of spending all your hard-earned cash on drinking water? Didn't you say you'd do anything to get a hold of some frax dust of your own? The deadwood will work, I assure you, he said as he sprinkled a liberal quality into the bowl. There will be no explosion, and you, my friend, will have frax dust to last you the rest of your life. Tendon fingered the charms around his neck anxiously. Despite his misgivings, however, the knock-goblin's offer proved too tempting to resist. He paid the over 100 quarters they'd agreed upon, picked up the pestle and raised it above his head. With the money safely in his pocket, Slitch scuttled off to the far end of the hut and crouched down behind a metal stove. Strike now, he cried. It will work! And Tendon, gripping the handle as tightly as his sweaty hands would allow, brought the pestle sharply down with all his strength. The explosion blew the roof of the hut right off. Tendon was hurled back against the far wall where he collapsed, a lifeless heap. Slitch crawled out of his hiding place and climbed shakily to his feet. He looked down at the body of the dead slaughterer. Oh, then again, he sighed. Maybe it won't. Part 6. In the Blood Oak Tavern. Mother Horsefeather sat at a table by the door of the heaving Blood Oak Tavern, perched on a bar stool behind her was Forficule, the night waif she employed. The pair of them were watching the rowdy groups of drinkers plunge their tankard into the communal trough of frothy wood ale one after another. The illicit brewery concealed in the cellar was a nice little earner, particularly when the weather was so hot. The door opened and 3 leaguesmen swaggered in. Mother Horsefeather clacked her beak with distaste. Good evening to you, she said, avoiding their gaze. She removed 3 tankards from the shelf behind her and placed them on the table. That'll be 20 quarters apiece. You can drink as much as you like, the first leaguesman, a regular to the Blood Oak, explained to the others. Is that not right, Mother Horsefeather? Mother Horsefeather scowled. Indeed it is, she said. But remember the rules. She nodded over to a sign nailed to the wall. No swearing, no fighting, no vomiting on the premises. We need no reminding, said the leaguesman as he handed her a single gold coin worth twice the asking price. Keep the change, dear lady, he said and winked. Mother Horsefeather stared down at the till. Thanking you kindly, sire, she said and slammed the drawer shut. Only when he turned away did she look up. You worm-ridden lump of Hamelhorn dung, she thought bitterly. Oh, now, said Forficule gently, his huge bat-like ears twitching. Mother Horsefeather swiveled her head around and glared furiously at the night elf. Heard that, did you? She snapped. I hear everything, Forficule replied. As well you know. Every word, every whisper, every thought. For my sins. Mother Horsefeather snorted. The feathers around her neck were standing on end. Her yellow eyes glinted. Well, he is, she said sourly, and nodded towards the table of leaguesmen. They all are. with their fine clothes, big tips, and fancy manners. Hammerhorn dung, the lot of them. Forfacule tutted sympathetically. He understood his employer's loathing of the Leaguesmen. Because of their alliance with Vilnix Pompolnius, building chains in return for frax dust, their dominance in the drinking water market had left them unassailably powerful. If it weren't for her black market dealings with the sky pirates, Mother Horsefeather would have gone under long ago. Ah, the sky pirates, Forfacule sighed. Those intrepid skyfaring brigands who will kowtow to no one. Where would we be without them? Where indeed, Mother Horsefeather nodded, her neck feathers finally lying down smooth. Speaking of which, Cloud Wolf and his crew should be back soon. I hope to goodness he's had as profitable a trip as he led me to believe. Otherwise... The conversation she had with the Professor of Light abruptly came back to her, and an idea appeared as if from nowhere. Her eyes twinkled. Unless... Forfacule, who'd been listening into her thoughts, chuckled. Heads you win, tails he loses, Before she had a chance to reply, the Blood Oak Tavern suddenly rocked with the force of a nearby explosion. Forfacule clutched at his ears and squealed with pain. Loxamussy! Mother Horsefeather cried out, and the ruff of feathers shot back upwards. That sounded close! As the dust settled, Forfacule removed his hands and shook his head from side to side. His massive ears fluttered like two enormous moths. Two more poor fools trying to grind their own frax dust, he said sadly. He cocked his head to one side and listened intently. The dead one is Tendon, a slaughterer. I remember him, said Mother Horsefeather. Often in here he is. Was. Always stank of leather. Forfacule nodded. The survivor's name is Slitch, he said and shuddered. Ooh, a horrible piece of work he is. He tried mixing storm frax with deadwood dust and got Tendon to do his dirty work for him. Mother Horsefeather frowned. Everyone is so desperate to get a hold of frax dust, she said. Her yellow eyes sparkled malevolently. If anyone's to blame for what happened, she added, nodding her beak towards the table of rowdy leaguesmen, it's them! Oh, what I wouldn't give to wipe that smug expression off their loathsome faces once and for all! Chapter 4. The Cargo of Ironwood. It was late afternoon, and, having successfully concluded a deal with some wood trolls for a massive consignment of ironwood, the crew of the Stormchaser were heading back to Undertown. The atmosphere aboard the Sky Pirate was buoyant, and Twig, the hero of the hour, was feeling particularly pleased with himself. Although he hadn't personally known any of the wood trolls they'd encountered, the fact that he'd been brought up in a wood troll village meant that Twig was familiar with their ways. He knew when their no's meant yes. He knew when to haggle, and more importantly, when to stop. For if a wood troll is offered too little for his wood, then he will take offense and refuse to sell no matter what. When Twig saw the telltale signs in their faces, a pursing of the lips and a twitching of their rubbery noses, he had nodded towards his father. The deal was as good as it could possibly be. Afterwards, to celebrate, Cloud Wolf had cracked open a barrel full of wood grog. And handed round tots of the fiery liquid to each member of his motley crew. To a job well done, he proclaimed. A job well done! The Sky Pirates roared back. Tem Barkwater, a hairy giant of an individual, slapped Twig on the back and squeezed his shoulder. Without this lad's knowledge of the deep woods folk, we would have never gotten the wood at such a price, he said and raised his glass. To Twig! To Twig! The Sky Pirates chorused. Even Slivo Spleeth, the quartermaster, who seldom had a good word to say to anyone, spoke generously.
He did indeed do well,
he conceded. Only one person failed to join the congratulations, Cloud Wolf himself. In fact, when Tem Barkwater had proposed his toast, the captain had turned away abruptly and returned to the helm. Twig understood why. None of the crew knew that he was Cloud Wolf's son. To avoid any accusations of favoritism, the captain preferred it that way. Accordingly, he treated the lad more harshly than any of the other crew members, and never betrayed any affection he might feel. Understanding the reason for Cloud Wolf's surliness was one thing. Liking it, however, was another. Every slight, every injustice, every harsh word cut Twig to the quick and left him feeling that his father was ashamed of him. Swallowing his pride now, Twig joined Cloud Wolf on the bridge.
When do you think we'll be back?
He asked tentatively. Nightfall, said Cloud Wolf as he locked the wheel and made minute adjustments to the hanging weights. If the winds remained favorable, that is. Twig watched his father in awe. Skyships were notoriously difficult to sail, yet to Cloud Wolf it came as second nature. He understood his ship as though it were a part of him. Having heard the caterbird story, Twig knew why.
I guess you learned all about sky sailing and storm chasing in the Knights Academy.
Cloud Wolf turned and stared at him curiously. What do you know about the Knights Academy? He demanded.
Nothing much,
Twig faltered.
But the caterbird told me.
Pfft, Cloud Wolf said dismissively. That scraggy blabbermouth. It's better to live in the present than dwell in the past, he said sharply. And then, clearly eager to change the subject, he added, It's high time you learn the rudiments of sky sailing. Twig's heart fluttered. He'd been with the Sky Pirates now for more than 2 years. Like them, he wore one of the heavy pirate longcoats with its numerous hanging accoutrements. The telescope, the grappling iron, the compass and scales, the drinking vessel. Like them, his front was protected by an ornately tooled leather breast shield, while on his back was a set of periwings. In all that time, however, Twig's duties on the board had been restricted to the most menial of tasks. He scrubbed, he cleaned, he was the all-purpose gopher. Now, it seemed, that was to change. The flight rock, when cold, gives us natural lift, Cloud Wolf explained. Balance, forward thrust, and maneuvering here have to be achieved manually. Through these, he said, and pointed to 2 long rows of bone-handled levers, each set at a different angle. Twig nodded keenly. These levers here are connected to the hanging weights, he said. The stern weight, prow weight, starboard hull weights, small, medium, and large, port hull weights, ditto. Mid-hull, peri-hull, nebbin-hull, and cloot-hull weights, he said, rattling off the names. And these levers on the other side are attached to the sails. Foresail, aft sail, top sail, he said, tapping the levers, each in turn. Mainsails, 1 and 2. Skysail, staysail, studsail, boomspail, spinnaker, and jib. Got that? It's just a matter of keeping everything in balance. Twig nodded uncertainly. Cloud Wolf stood back. Come on, then, he said gruffly. Take the wheel, and let's see what you're made of. At first, it was easy. The adjustments had already been made, and Twig merely had to grip the wooden wheel to hold a steady course. But when a sudden gust from the northeast caused the ship to dip, the task suddenly became more complicated. Up the medium starboard hull weight, the captain instructed. Twig panicked.
Which lever was it? The 8th or 9th from the left?
He grasped the 9th and yanked. The Stormchaser tipped to one side. Not that much, Cloud Wolf snapped. Up the staysail a tad and down the large porthole weight. The porthole weight, you idiot! He roared as the skyship tipped over still further. Twig yelped with terror. He was going to crash the boat. At this rate, his first attempt at sky sailing would be his last. He clung onto the helm grimly, brain feverish, hands shaking, heart thumping fit to burst. He mustn't let his father down. Pulling himself forwards, he seized the 9th lever for a second time. This time he moved it down gently, downing the weight only a couple of notches. And it worked! The boat righted itself! Good, the captain said. You're developing the touch. Now, up the skysail, he instructed. Down the prow weight a fraction, realign the small and medium starboard hull weights, and... League ship to starboard! Spiker's strident voice cried out. League ship to starboard and approaching fast! The words echoed round Twig's head. He felt short of breath. He felt sick. The rows of levers blurred before his eyes. One of them would almost certainly make the skyship accelerate forwards. But which one? League ship getting closer, Spiker announced. And Twig, in his blind panic, broke the first rule of skyship sailing. He let go of the helm. The wheel spun back viciously the moment his sweaty hands loosened their grip. sending him skittering across the deck. Instantly, the sails crumpled and the Stormchaser went into a spinning descent. "You half-wit!" Cloud Wolf roared. He seized the wheel and, bracing himself against the deck, frantically tried to stop it turning. "Hubble!" he bellowed. "Here! Now!" Twig was just stumbling back onto his feet when Hubble brushed past him. It was only the most glancing of blows, but the albino Banderbear was a colossal mountain of a creature, and Twig went flying. The next moment the spinning stopped. Twig looked up. The wheel was clasped, motionless in the Banderbear's massive paws, and the captain, freed up at last, was running his hands over the levers, now here, now there, as surely as an accordion player darting over the keys. "League ship 100 strides and closing," called Spiker. The captain's silent plane continued. 50 strides. 40. All at once the Stormchaser leapt forwards. The crew roared their approval. Twig staggered to his feet at last, muttering heartfelt thanks to sky above. They'd made it. Then Cloud Wolf spoke. "There's something wrong," he said quietly.
Wrong, thought Twig. What could be wrong? Hadn't they escaped with their illicit cargo of ironwood after all?
He squinted behind him.
Yes, there was the League ship miles away.
"Something very wrong," he said. "We've got no lift." Twig stared at Cloud Wolf in horror. His stomach felt empty. Was this some kind of joke? Had he chosen this moment to tease him like a father? One look at the man's ashen face as he jiggled, jerked, and yanked at a lever with more and more force confirmed that he'd not. It's the blasted sternweight," he spluttered. "It's jammed." "League ship gaining once more," Spiker called out. "And from the flag, I'd say the League's master himself was on board." Cloud Wolf spun round. "Hubble," he said, but then had second thoughts. The massive creature was ill-suited to clambering over the hull, as were Tem Barkwater and Stope Boltjaw, and the Oak Elf Spiker, though willing, would never be strong enough to release the great iron weight. Slivo Spleeth would have been ideal if he wasn't such a coward, while Mugbutt the Flathead Goblin, though fearless in battle and everything else, was too stupid to remember what he had to do. "I'd better see to it myself," he muttered. Twig leapt forwards.
"Let me," he said. "I can do it."
Cloud Wolf looked him up and down, his thin lips tightly pursed.
"You need to stay here, at the levers," Twig went on, "for when I've released it." "League ship at 200 strides," Spiker called. Cloud Wolf nodded briefly. "All right," he said, "but be sure not to let me down." "I won't," said Twig grimly as he hurried off to the back of the ship. There he seized the tolly rope and pulled himself up onto the rail. A flash of forest green blurred past him far, far below. "Don't look down!" he heard Tem Barkwater shouting to him. Easier said than done, thought Twig as he lowered himself carefully into the hull rigging, which hugged the bottom of the ship like cobwebs. The further down and round he went, slowly, carefully, the more upside down he became. The wind tugged his hair and plucked at his fingers, but he could see the sternweight now, all tangled up in a loop of pitched rope. He kept on, whispering words of encouragement to himself as he went. "Just a little bit further. Just a teeny bit more." "How's it going?" he heard his father called. "Nearly there," he shouted back. "League ship back on 100 strides and closing," came Spiker's latest update. Trembling with anticipation, Twig reached forwards and pulled the clump of rope hard to one side. The weight should be swinging free. If he could just... He inched forward and pushed the back of the huge knot with the heel of his hand. Suddenly it gave. The rope came loose. The weight swung down and fell completely away. Twig gasped in absolute horror as the huge round circle of iron tumbled off through the air down to the forest below. "What have you done?" came a voice. It was Cloud Wolf, and he sounded furious. I... Twig began. The skyship was rolling from end to end and reeling from port to starboard, completely out of control. It was all Twig could do to hang on. What had he done? You've only gone and released the rudder wheel! Cloud Wolf yelled. For Sky's sake, Twig, I thought that Mugbutt was stupid! Twig quaked under the barrage of insults and recriminations. Scalding tears welled in his eyes. Tears he couldn't wipe away for fear of losing his grip. Then again, he thought miserably, wouldn't it be simply better to let go? To disappear? Anything rather than face his father's wrath. Twig, can you hear me, lad? Came a second voice. It was Tem Barkwater. We're gonna have to ditch our cargo. That means opening the whole doors. You best get yourself out of there sharpish. Ditch the cargo? Twig's heart sank and his tears flowed even more freely than ever. The ironwood, which had taken so much effort and money to acquire, would have to go. All because of him. Come on! Tem screamed. Twig climbed feverishly back along the hull rigging, hand over hand, foot over foot, until he was climbing upright once more. He looked up. Tem Barkwater's huge red hand was reaching down for him. He grasped it gratefully and gasped as he was pulled back onto the deck. Righto, Captain! Tem cried. Twig went to smile his thanks, but the sky pirate had already turned away, unable to meet his gaze. And, though squalid, Undertown was not the place to be with neither money nor the means to make it. Open the hull doors! Cloud Wolf commanded. Aye, aye, Captain, came the voice of Stope Boltjaw from the hold. Then, from deep within the bowels of the ship, there came a clanking of chains, followed by a rumbling thud, thud, thud. Twig looked away guiltily. It was the ironwood logs tumbling one after the other through the gap beneath the hull as the doors were slowly cranked open. He glanced over the side. As he did so, the rest of the load was abruptly discharged. A strange and deadly precipitation. It tumbled back down to the deep woods from whence it came. On seeing what was taking place just in front of them, the League ship immediately gave up the chase and swooped down after the falling logs. A load that size was not to be sniffed at. Twig's misery was complete. The Stormchaser's loss had turned to the League ship's gain. Can't we go down and battle it out with them? Twig asked. I'm not afraid. Cloud Wolf turned on him with a look of utter contempt. We have no rudder wheel, he said. No control. It's only the flight rock keeping us skyborne at all. He turned away. Raise the main sheets, he bellowed. Square the bitchets and pray. Pray like you've never prayed before. An untimely squall, and it won't be just the cargo we lose. It'll be the Stormchaser itself. No one spoke a word as the sky ship limped back to Undertown. It was the slowest and most nail-biting trip that Twig had ever endured. Darkness had fallen by the time the fuzzy lights of Sanctifrax came into view. Below it, Undertown seethed and gagged beneath a heavy pall of smoke. And still the silence continued. Twig felt wretched. It would have been better if the Sky Pirates had ranted and raved, called him every name under the sky. Anything but this deathly hush. There were patrol boats around, but none took any notice of the crippled skyship as it headed in towards the boom docks. With its hull doors still open, the craft clearly had nothing to hide. Cloud Wolf steered the Stormchaser into its concealed berth. Stope Boltjaw dropped anchor, and Spiker jumped down onto the raised jetty to secure the ship's tally ropes to the tether rings. The crew disembarked. Outstanding, Master Twig, Slivo Spleeth hissed as he passed him by. Twig shuddered, but the comment was only to be expected. Spleeth had never liked him. Worse by far were the averted eyes of the others. He shuffled miserably after them towards the gangplank. Not you, Twig, said Cloud Wolf sharply. Twig froze. Now he was for it. He turned round, hung his head, and waited. Only when the last sky pirate had departed did Cloud Wolf speak. That I should live to see the day when my son, my own son, should scupper a sky ship, he said. Twig swallowed hard, but the tears would not go away. I'm sorry,
he whispered.
Sorry? What good is sorry? Cloud Wolf thundered. We've lost the ironwood, the rudder wheel, we almost lost the Stormchaser itself, and I still might. His eye glinted like hard flint. I'm ashamed to call you my son. The word struck Twig like a blow to the back of the neck. Ashamed to call me your son, he said, and as he spoke, his distress turned to anger. He looked up boldly. So what's new? He demanded. How dare you? Cloud Wolf raged, his face turning purple. But Twig did dare. You've never acknowledged to anyone ever that you're my father, he said. Does that mean you've always been ashamed of me, ever since the moment we first found each other? Does it? Well, does it? Tell me it does and I'll leave! Now! Cloud Wolf remained silent. Twig turned to go. Twig! Said Cloud Wolf. Wait. Twig stopped. Turn and face me, boy, he said. Twig turned slowly round. He stared up at his father defiantly. Cloud Wolf stared back, a twinkle in his eye. That was well said, he told him. You're right. I've not acknowledged who you are on board the ship. But not for the reason you suppose. There are those who would mutiny given half the chance and take the Stormchaser for themselves. If they found out what... He paused. How important you are to me. For you are important to me, Twig. You should know that. Twig nodded and sniffed. The lump in his throat was back. If they found that out, it would put your own life in the gravest danger. Twig let his head hang. How could he have ever doubted what his father felt for him? Now he was the one who felt ashamed. He looked up and smiled sheepishly. Can I stay, then? He said. Cloud Wolf's face creased up with concern. I meant it when I said I might still lose the Stormchaser, he said. But how? Twig said. Why? It's your skyship, isn't it? I thought you took it on the day of your inauguration. Cloud Wolf snorted. It cost a lot to keep a skyship aloft, he said. And ever since that infestation of wood bugs, the Stormchaser's been in debt up to the top of a pretty cicada nest. I was depending on the ironwood to pay off some of that money I owe. No, he sighed. If anyone owns the Stormchaser, it's Mother Horsefeather. She's the one who finances us, and rakes most off the profits of the bargain. He added with a scowl. And now that I can't pay her, she might well decide to take back what's rightfully hers. Twig was appalled. But she can't, he cried. Oh, but she can, said Cloud Wolf. What's more, she'd make sure I never got credit anywhere else. And what's a sky pirate captain without a skyship, Twig? Eh? I'll tell you. Nothing. That's what he is. Nothing at all. Twig turned his head away, distraught. His father, once the finest knight academic Sanctifrax had ever seen, now the greatest sky pirate in the Edge, was staring ignominy in the face. And he, Twig, was to blame. It was all his fault. Just don't say you're sorry again, Cloud Wolf interrupted. Come on, let's go and get this over with, he said gruffly. I just hope the old buzzard's not in too greedy a mood. And remember, he said as he strode off towards the gangplank, when we're sat down talking with Mother Horsefeather in the Blood Oak Tavern, you must be careful what you say, or even think. I swear the walls in there have ears.